Let's talk about working with compliance as a product manager. Now, if you worked in a company, you have probably come across this world of compliance and risk management, especially if you're working in industries or domains that require heavy regulation. For example, if you're in fintech, financial services, if you're in banking or financial sector, you are quite heavily regulated. If you're in the healthcare industry or if you're in the food industry, you are heavily regulated. This is because the country that you operate in has certain rules and regulations under which you can sell product or services. So you might already have come across some of these compliance rules or regulations, and you have to adjust your product experience according to this compliance guidelines. Now, for a person who is just starting out, it can be quite daunting to understand what this really means. As a product manager, you are not expected to be expert in compliance and risk management. However, you are expected to understand what this means for the product and for the business. Because you drive the decision making in the company and for your product, it is very important to understand why and how these compliance guidelines apply to your product. So how does this really work? Imagine a set of concentric circles. At the very center, you could have compliance rules at the company level itself. There are certain guidelines that the company abides by and tells that this is what we want to adhere to, and they become your compliance rules. For example, we do not want to sell our products to people under 18. That's a compliance guideline set by the company itself. Another compliance guideline could be we do not wish to sell in a certain country or a certain continent. This means when your user is trying to access your product from that country or continent, they need to be blocked or some action needs to be taken. So the users from there cannot be allowed. So these are some of the compliance rules that can be set at a company level. If you go a little wider than that, you have to see what are the compliance guidelines applicable from the country of operations or the home country that you are in. Let's say you are headquartered in Singapore or you are headquartered in US. Whatever the regulations are set up by the authorities in these countries, you have to abide by it. So let's imagine USA says that if you want to sell anything online that is medicinal or in the category of medicines, it has to be approved by FDA. Now, if it is not approved by FDA, you cannot sell it. This is a compliance guideline set by a regulatory authority in that country. Now, if you are a company that is selling food items that are in the category of medicines, then you have to make sure that your products are FDA approved. That's what it would mean. So you cannot list a product that is not FDA approved in that category and make a sale, because then you are non-compliant. Let's take another example. Let's assume you are a company in financial services or fintech, and one of the rules that your country has set up for your international transfers is you cannot transfer more than $10,000 in a single payment. Now, if you are a payment remittance app, you have to abide by this rule because that is set up by the country where you are operating. So these are the set of guidelines that are set up by the authorities that companies have to abide by if you're headquartered there or if you're selling there. If you increase that sphere a little bit more, now you are looking at country of operations where you're selling to other countries. So let's assume you are based in Singapore, but your products are getting sold in USA. Now you have to make sure that you are abiding by US's compliance laws and regulations. This is very important point because you not only have to be compliant in the home country, but also in the country of operations. And wherever you sell, you have to be compliant there as well. You have to ensure that if your product is getting sold in different countries, are you abiding by the compliance guidelines in that country? And the last level in this sphere of influence or in the concentric circle could be global or domain specific compliance laws. Now, sometimes you may not really have to abide by country specific thing, but it could be an organization that tells or dictates because you are in that particular domain. Now, there might be an organization such as OFAC or OFAC in USA that has blacklisted certain number of people and certain countries as well. Now, because you are in that industry, you generally want to abide by the compliance rules set up by them. Now, this is not mandatory and this is something that comes from an expert opinion. So let's talk about who is the deciding entity when it comes to compliance. Now, typically a product manager is not considered as an expert on this matter. You may have a lot of knowledge, but you cannot be the deciding person. And this is very important to understand depending on the industry you are in. Now, let's assume you are in fintech industry. You need someone who is titled as compliance officer, trained in AML, that is anti-money laundering or risk management, or has some sort of financial background or risk management background. In your company, that could be fulfilled by multiple people. It could be be a single person or it could be a team. So you have to identify which team is responsible for giving you these decisions and giving you the latest guidelines on this. In cases where you do not have a team, you have to bring this up to other teams and make it a consensual decision. Try to make it as a document, share it across, get some comments on, and see if that's a necessary thing to do in your product. As a product manager, you have to be aware of the regulatory bodies and the authorities that give out these guidelines. So even if your compliance team is not up to date, you should be up to date if you manage this product. Now, once you have this latest guideline, how do we identify whether we have to implement the changes in the product or not? This is where your craft comes into picture. Now is when you have to identify what is the requirement, what is the change required in your product, and how does this impact the users. Now, as soon as you understand that there is a latest guideline and you have to make a change in your product, you have to get into action and you have to start your product discovery right away. One of the important things to understand about this compliance rules is it's not a nice to have thing, it's a must have thing in many cases. So let's take an example of Fintech. Now imagine you're a payments company transferring money from one country to another, and the regulatory body in that country has issued a guideline saying that you cannot transfer more than $10,000 in a single payment transfer. If your product does not have this check implemented at the time of making this transfer, this is the guideline that you have to abide by. And typically when a guideline has been issued, they give you the deadline as well. That is part of the discovery. You have to understand whether every guideline needs to be implemented now or can it be done later. One of the things that you have to remember while prioritizing these things is what is the legal implication of non-compliance. What could go wrong if you do not implement this today versus if you implement it after 3 months. Check those impact points and see what makes most sense. The next thing you have to do is understand the impact of this change on your product and on your users. How does it change the user experience end to end? Not simply by making a change in this one screen, but also look at all the communication that goes out to the users. For example, we talked about this payment transfer limit. Now imagine you are making a transfer and in the screen you can show you cannot transfer more than $10,000. This means you have to change your knowledge base, the support articles that you have, the email communication wherever you may have communicated about the payment limits, and those things have to be updated as well. So you have to look at end-to-end experience of taking that change into account, draw out the user's journey when it comes to making this payment transfer, and see where the changes are required even in the communication. Let's just do a thought experiment of you being assigned to a product which is now falling under this compliance guidelines, and now it is your responsibility to ensure that the product is compliant. Where do you begin with this? What are the regulations? What is the change that is expected? What are the changes that are already implemented? What are the guidelines that we abide by already? And document that. So for example, if you're into payments, you may have limits on the payment amount. You may have limits on which countries you can transfer to. You may have something like a blocking country, like sanctioned countries. You cannot transfer to these countries. So you may already have certain validations and checks and balances in your product. Sit with an engineering team or the team that has devised this in the past and start documenting the existing compliance rules that are already established. So you have to draw out the entire journey and then find out at which point do these compliance regulations apply. Once you have that list, now you go and check where are the gaps. You have to identify the gaps based on the latest guidelines. Once you've identified the gaps, the next thing you would have to do is prioritize them. You do not want to get into the task of implementing every single compliance rule that is out there simply because you thought that was a gap. Now, one of the things you could do here is get those list of items in your document or any tool that you're using. Go and talk to the compliance team and identify which are the most important things to do. The compliance team might start ranking them based on their understanding of legal implications. So there will be certain things which are very, very important and high priority changes, and those go to the top, and they will help you identify some of the low priority tasks for you. Now, once you've identified all this, get into the design and development phase. Now, design phase is where you have to ensure that all stakeholders are involved in this. This is not a work that needs to be done in silo. If you tend to do the work in silo, you're going to have some trouble. And trust me, this comes from an experience where if you do not show your design iterations and straight away go to the production, you're going to have some trouble. This is not because you do not have autonomy on the product. It is because of the nature of you operating in that industry. And that's something you have to be comfortable with and accept it as a fact. Now that you have got all the list of items, you've done the design iterations, you've gone into development, you get into the testing phase. Testing phase is typically where I would also involve involve the compliance team or risk management team, along with your QA team, of course, and your development team who is testing it. It is important to show the changes that you are about to release before making the actual release. The reason to do this rigorous process for compliance related feature, you cannot afford to have issues in the production. This can cause you legal implications. So be sure that you have checked every single thing during the testing process. So handling compliance requirements is no different from handling any other product requirements. However, you have to be aware of the nuances and the implications of not delivering on those requirements. This is not a comprehensive video of covering all aspects of compliance requirements handling as a product manager, but it should serve as a general guideline for you to operate in this role. So I hope this video was helpful in that aspect. Thanks for watching.